This is the 6th video in a series showing how to set up, configure, test, and debug the MVS Toolkit. In this video, we'll cover how to use the Toolkit Client IDE to test web services, drop web services, export web services, and import web services. Okay, time to test the Toolkit. We'll show two methods of testing. The first method of testing is from within the Client's IDE test dialog, which you access by right-clicking the web service and selecting Test. The second method is to copy the URI created by the IDE's test dialog and pasting it into a browser. To test from within the IDE, go to the upper left-hand panel, select and right-click a web service, then click Test Web Service in the context menu. The test dialog will now appear. You can test either using GET or POST by using the service port drop-down. The first choice is GET, so just leave that alone for now. Below that is an Operations drop-down. Click the drop-down and select the resource or operation you're trying to test. Now go down to the Operation Parameters dialog and supply whatever values you need to supply, then press the Execute button to test. At this point, the test response dialog will appear showing the XML or JSON packet that is returned if the test succeeds, or the relevant HTTP error if the test fails. To test in a browser, click back on the Test Dialog tab and look down in the Request dialog to see that the URI changed in that the values you supplied are now present. Copy that URI and paste it into a browser. You should get the same result you get in the IDE's test response dialog. You can also remove or drop definitions. This is useful if you are cleaning out the web service provider in preparation for an import, removing services that are no longer used, like the ones you defined to test the system in the first place, or any other reason you need to clean up. Dropping is simple. Simply right-click on the thing you're trying to drop and click Drop. Warning: do not drop the web service provider while the Toolkit service is running, as this will remove all web service definitions from the server. Let me say it again. Do not drop the web service provider while the Toolkit server is running, as this will remove all web service definitions from the server. The only reason you would probably do this is to remove the web service provider definition from your IDE, and it feels right to just drop it. Don't do it without stopping the server first. If you cannot stop the server because it's in production, another way to remove it from the IDE is to delete the MV tool folder from wherever it is, hopefully in C users public. If you have multiple web service providers defined in this IDE and deleting the folder is not an option, you can edit the wsp.xml file in the MV tool folder and simply remove the definition by hand. Simply find the web service provider connection beginning and ending tags for the service you're trying to drop and delete those tags and everything in between. Exporting web services. Whenever changes are made to any of the web service definitions, it's a really good idea to do a web service export. This creates an XML file that has all the information on your web service provider, your web services, your web service resources and operations, your dynamic and array definitions, and your MV server definitions. This is used not only to migrate services from a test to a live environment, but also to recover from any corruption in the Toolkit server's database. It's like having a file save for D3. This process is really easy. In the Toolkit IDE, right-click on the web service provider and select Export Web Services from the context menu. You'll then be prompted for a location and XML file name. Go ahead and use the default if you wish, but you make absolutely sure you remember the path and file name so you can find it when you go to import. The dialog also lists all the web services hosted by the web service provider with checkboxes next to them so that you can export them all or just some subset of them. Use the checkboxes and the Select All and Deselect All buttons to get the subset you want. Subsets are good for deployment of select web services to other servers, but make sure you have a current export of all your web services for disaster recovery. Once you've clicked Finish, the XML file will be created and you'll be prompted with a success message on which you click OK. Copy the file to several places just like you would a D3 file save. Importing web services. This again is something you would do to migrate web services from one server to another or to recover web services in the event of Toolkit server database corruption. To start the import, make sure you know the location of the web service export file from the import step. Then right-click the web service provider and select Import Web Services from the context menu. Browse to the location of the export file, click Open, then click Next. You'll see little progress messages throughout this process. Click Next at the Configure Database Connections dialog. You'll then be presented a larger dialog which gives you the option to selectively import all or some subset of the web services contained in the export. Use the checkboxes and the Select All and Deselect All buttons to make your choices. Now you're presented with the Configure Database Connections dialog, which lists all of the web service operations and resources. If you're deploying to another server, you'll probably need to change the MV database connections. Highlight the appropriate resources and operations and press the Edit button. We'll detail editing on the next slide, but when you return to this dialog, you can click the Test Connection button to make sure you did everything correctly and press Next. Notice that you have access to all the relevant MV server fields here: host name, connection pool, settings, etc. Make whatever changes and press the Test Connection button. Once successful, press Finish. You'll be returned to the dialog on the previous slide in which you'll click Next. On the Verify Services to Import dialog, press Finish. You'll now be presented with a status dialog while the import is processed. If for some reason you're importing web services into a server where they're already defined, you'll be presented a Web Service Exists dialog where you need to click Yes or No to indicate whether you want to import this one web service. After that step completes, you'll be presented with a dialog to import users. If you're not using users with your web services and are not using the Rocket Discover product, and most people are not, just hit Cancel at that dialog and OK at the User Not Added dialog. Then press OK at the Web Service Import Successful dialog and you're done. In the next video, we'll talk about debugging the MVS Toolkit. If you have any questions about any of the content we've covered so far, please contact Rocket D3 Support.